So thank you for being here or to listening. We will have a similar setup as in the talk before, that I will divide my time with Peter. I will start with a few advances on matrix-free and multigrid infrastructure, and Peter will talk about the rest. And this is, of course, not just work by the two of us, but we have had other people contributing a lot, like Max, Niklas, Dmytro, Magdalena, and even others in our groups. So let me start with the matrix-free methods and the advances that we did here. Just as a big background, why do we do this, or what is the kind of the motivation here? I just have a motivating slide here. Why do we do this? This is one of the high performance parts in deal.II, and we do this because many iterative solvers have a lot of associated costs, like many big simulations are limited by them. And then, of course, when you look closer, then you see that the matrix vector product inside iterative solvers is the dominating cost here. And matrix-free methods are essentially a way of speeding up these operations. And just as a short graph here, what I show you here on the right-hand side of the plot here is some throughput. So it's counts on an experiment of a fixed size, maybe 10 million unknowns. Then you measure the time, and then you divide the number of unknowns that you have in the mesh by the computing time that you have, and then you get a throughput. And in these graphs, you always try to be higher up, because that means that you're quicker. And what I show you here is there's a black line here below, which is hardly to see for higher polynomial degrees, just because they get slow for high degrees, because you have many couplings between the unknowns. And matrix-free methods have actually the property that it goes the other way around. So when you increase the polynomial degree, you can process more unknowns. And this is something very surprising when you look at it, because it goes against intuition. And there is two ingredients why this can happen. And one is that there is tricks you can do, at least on the hexahedral and polylateral elements that we have in deal.II. There is tensor product structure, which allows you to break down this to pretty efficient operations. And the other thing is that these operations are implemented in a clever way. So we use a lot of hardware, and so higher orders, they're gaining from the hardware that you can do vectorization and other things. And especially memory access is an important one. And just as a single figure here, if you're in 3D and you're going from polynomial degree 3 or from a matrix to a matrix-free representation, you can expect around a factor of 10 in performance improvement. So it just reduces your times per factor of 10 in the matrix vector product. So this is a nice result. Now we get for continuous elements, for DG elements. Now there is a very high graph up here. The blue curve is just when you have a lot of structure, then we can make this run like a finite difference method, essentially. And that's, of course, a nice result here. What more do we have, or how does it look like in deal.II? We have various classes here. And with the matrix-free class, which is kind of a data container, so it kind of suggests that this is kind of the central algorithm, but it's actually just the one that holds things. And what we do is we write the codes. We use this FEPointEvaluation and FEPhase evaluation for cell integrals and phase integrals for doing that. And they're optimized for this fast integration scheme that I mentioned before. This is called sum factorization, just using the tensor product structure. And they really give you a nice performance here. And we've done a lot of optimization in deal.II. Of course, MPI parallel, we have used this on supercomputers, and we have various example steps here. So I just list a few of or just list them here. Like step 37 is the first one that we had already 9 years ago, if I counted correctly, 2012. And then we had a few others following up here in various scenarios, multigrid, and so on. So there's many things coming together here. And one of the things that we have looked at recently is the graph that you see here. Now, I told you before, we have a lot of optimization that went into these classes. And then you can always wonder, well, how fast can you be? And what happened now is that the matrix vector product, when you look at the breakdown of the times for different problem case sizes here, that the matrix vector product, the green part, is not the dominating cost anymore. And that's what happens now. This is a conjugate gradient solver with a diagonal preconditioner. This is as simple as it can get. But you see here the matrix vector product for large sizes here on the right end of my plot here, that's maybe only a third of the compute time in total. And the rest is just the vector updates, preconditioner, the things that when you learn linear algebra, that people tell you this is for free. And it's not for free anymore, just because we've tuned the green part so much. And that then means, of course, we have to look at it and what happens. Now, just as a remark here, in the middle size, 10 to the 6 to 10 to the 7 unknowns on a node, this is the regime where everything fits into the caches. So this is why the matrix vector product dominates here in between. But for very large sizes, the vectors don't fit into the cache, and then you need to go from main memory, which is much slower than the caches. And that's what happens here. And what we did, or what we are in the process of doing during the last year already, and we will do more, is that we have looked into the matrix-free algorithms, which essentially just are representing a loop over the cells and just do the operator evaluation. And we started putting other operations inside of this loop just to use the data locality. So for example, we can do a conjugate gradient solver where we do some vector updates. So that's the blue part in this short graph of the mesh here, which we do before the matrix vector product touches them. So that kind of just gives us the right vector. Then we let on the green cell here, we let the matrix vector product computes the integral. And when the cell is done, we kind of say, okay, well, now we know that, okay, every result is ready. Then we can do inner products, for example. And this, of course, means that the red crosses here, just meaning that that's what I do afterwards. And if the blue circles here, the red crosses are close enough to each other, then you can just reutilize the vectors that you have loaded for the vector updates before operating on the cell to afterwards. Of course, there's a lot of dependency tracking that you need to do, and it looks kind of complicated to get correct, and of course it is, but we're finding a nice improvement. So what you see here in the graph is that for small sizes, it's about the same performance just because the caches were so quick. But when you go to large sizes, then to the 7, then to the 8, you see that there is a factor of 2.5 that you can gain. This is some things that we plan to get more into the library. We have some steps prepared for that. So like the cell loop of the matrix-free code that can already do that, but we have not really implemented the conjugate gradient solver in deal.II. We have it in a private branch, and that's something we try to push into the library. And of course, there's other things we can do. Okay, second topic here I want to discuss is multigrid. Now in multigrid, we have had algorithms before, which are called so-called local smoothing. So this is kind of the things when you do smoothing just on a particular level of the mesh hierarchy, and when you have adaptive refinements, you might skip some parts of the mesh. And now we've started implementing another variant, mainly by Peter, where we do so-called global coarsening, where you say that you always look on the full mesh. So essentially, we do this on all cells that we have. Even if we have local refinement somewhere in the mesh, we still do smoothing also on the yellow parts or on the outer parts. Now, this is, of course, now combination with different polynomial degrees even, but the important part is that by this, it's easier to get good load balancing and get it done also when you have more refinement, more complicated situations. This infrastructure, as I suggested, it's not just there for doing the coarsening hierarchy as you see on the right of my screen, but it's also for different polynomial degrees. So you can do this just for reducing the polynomial degrees, another set of coarsening. And that's, of course, a very powerful setup here. Now, how do you use it? We have in deal.II essentially a new class here, which is called MG two-level transfer. So we just boil it down in an abstract level to transfer between two levels. And we can, for example, say, well, we have two different DOF handlers living on two different triangulations with different constraints. So they can have arbitrary things, even HB adaptivity, as you saw before. And then you get a transfer operator between the two. And you can do polynomial transfers. So this is really the strength here. It looks the same no matter if there is geometric transfer, just meaning different meshes or different polynomial degrees. And then you can collect all of these transfer objects into this global coarsening transfer, which is then the usual interface in multigrid. So essentially, this is a data structure which can do restriction from one level to the other or prolongation, which you need in multigrid algorithms. And then you just say, of course, how do we create them? We have a few options here. We have, for example, for polynomial coarsening, would just mean if I go from high degree to low degree, we can just immediately go to 1. So if you have polynomial degree 4, for example, you can immediately jump to 1, which is most of the time not the most efficient choice. You might go from 4 to 2 to 1 maybe, which is bisection, or you could just decrease by 1 if you want to. And the geometric one, of course, means this gives you different grids. And we have used them on big supercomputers. We have used them on 300,000 MPI ranks, and they work pretty well. Okay, that's all from my side. I think I want to hand over to Peter, so he has some time as well.
Okay, also welcome from my side. So I will continue with the non-matching support in deal.II and its recent advances. Here I would like to point out especially one new class, the FEPointEvaluation class. as the name already suggests, it's kind of similar to the FEPointEvaluation class in the sense that the interface is quite similar. So we also have like the functions evaluate and integrate. However, what's the difference is that it doesn't work on a fixed set of quadrature points as in the usual case, like indicated here left in the corner, where you always have the same set of quadrature points in every cell. Instead, you can have an arbitrary number of quadrature points at arbitrary locations in each of your cells. So possible applications of this is like if you want to combine or couple particles with some FEM solution, like indicated here in the left picture. And if you want to couple a fluid into structure, when you have to exchange data like deformation or stresses at the quadrature point level. Or another application is this one in the middle, where if you do sharp interface methods to do some two-phase flow simulation. Here we have a CODEM mesh which tracks the interface, and at the quadrature points we need to evaluate, for example, the velocity, and we have to compute the stresses which is contributed to the Navier-Stokes solver, which is solved on the background mesh. So as I said, computing the surface tension is quite important. And I take this as an example to show how to use this FEPointEvaluation class. So the term what we want to evaluate looks like this. And what you have to notice is that we want to integrate over gamma. And gamma is our interface which goes through the cell. And actually we don't want to integrate, but we want to perform a quadrature. So we need some quadrature points within that cells, and we need some weights, which are marked red here and also in the formula. So I don't discuss where these points are coming from and the weights, but we assume now that they are existing. What I would like to point out also that V is living on the background mesh, and also in this particular example, kappa, the curvature, and the normal vector also live on the background mesh. And they can be obtained, for example, from some kind of level set field. And the resulting code would look like this. And I don't go through all of these lines, but I guess everyone who has already used matrix tree sees the similarity. So you practically write the weak form just like as you would write it in the matrix tree infrastructure, which is kind of cool. And also what I would like to point out that instead of calling RAINIT with some integers or some integer, as in the case of matrix tree, you have to pass here a cell, which is actually a cell accessor, and the reference points, so these points. So we need a pointer to the cells, and we need the reference to these points. And now the question is, how do we get these information? And there have been different approaches in deal.II for that, but I would like to concentrate here just on one new approach, which is this remote point evaluation class. It has more functionality than just finding the cells and the reference position. It also sets up on the way a communication pattern. So for example, we have a mesh like here, which is distributed to 3 processes, and we want to evaluate our solution at these points. And this remote point evaluation does more or less the work for you by sending the points to the right process and setting up the communication pattern so that you know here from where you have to receive the information. And it's also responsible for sorting the data in the right order. Okay, so much to this. now I would like to continue with the experimental simplex and mismatch support in deal.II. So for those who don't know the term simplex, it's a generalization of the term triangles and tetrahedrons. And yeah, so let's have a look. What does that mean for you? So essentially that means that deal.II has now, alongside of vertices, lines, quadrilateral and hexahedrons, also triangles, tetrahedrons, pyramids, and wedges as cell types. These last two are especially for the purpose if you want to have mixed meshes. So meshes which contain both tetrahedrons and hexahedrons. And you somehow need to glue together triangles and quadrilaterals. And that's not possible if you don't have these intermediate elements. So, of course, now the question is, why should you want to use simplices in the first place? So essentially, many of your favorite mesh generation tools, they produce quite well TET meshes, and you could convert these into hex meshes, but the resulting meshes are quite bad, and especially the condition numbers are not really optimal. So that's why to have a simplex support is quite important. So here on the left, you see definitely a complex geometry. It's a heart, and it was submitted by Pascal from the MOX group from Polemy in Milano. And they did some simulation on this TET mesh with deal.II 9.3, and the results are shown here. So some other complex geometries are shown here. So here we have an impeller, a porous domain, and an Ahmed body. So all very important applications in the context of CFD. And these were provided by Bruno and Olivier from Canada. So until now, we talked about more or less complex meshes. Now I would shortly talk about in which context we have tried it already out, if it's this simplex support already works. So we've tried it out on a single phase flow, a two-phase flow example, a multi-physics problem, Melpool problem, and some solid mechanics. And it worked quite well till now. However, of course, if you want to get started with this new infrastructure, you probably won't start with complex setups like shown here. You will probably want to start with a simple Poisson example, just like in step 3. So, and instead of simulating that on a mesh on quadrilaterals, you would like to simulate it on a mesh of triangles, like in this case. And we have provided you with an example. So we provided you a ported step 3. So you can find that on the simplex support module page. So I guess you all know the in Doxygen, the module page button at the top, and there you can choose the simplex support part. So I won't show you the code, the complete code here. I just want to concentrate on the diffs. But before doing that, you first of all have to know what is actually enabling the simplex support in deal.II. So you have to know, do you have to use new classes, or are actually the old classes extended for this new functionality? And the answer is, well, we did both. So in the case of finite elements, quadrature rules, and mapping, we have created new classes. So each cell type has its own finite element, for instance. But in the case of triangulation and these grid processing tools, we have extended the existing functionalities so that they can handle both simplex measures and mixed measures. So now let's get to the promised diffs. So on the left, you see the old code, so which works on measures of quads. And on the right, you see the code which works on triangles. And what you have to do is, first of all, you have to switch the finite element and the quadrature rule. So these are these two lines. And what you also have to do is replace the implicit mapping here with another mapping, which works for simplexes. And of course, you have to include the right files. And essentially, that's it. What you have to do here at the bottom is not really related with the simplexes. It's more related with the fact that we have selected a different mapping class. And so we have to pass in it to FEValues and the vector to the function. So, but that's also what you are doing if you select some other mapping classes. Okay, that was not too much work to extend step 3 to simplex measures. Now I would like to make some general comments on how to use this new infrastructure. So first suggestion is that you more or less create the mappings and finite elements and quadrature rules at one central place. And from the tutorials, you've probably seen it that it's always often created before FEValues or whatever. That's not a good approach. Then you would need too much if statements, checking if your mesh has triangles or quads. So this should happen centrally, and then you pass it around by reference. Also, it might be useful to use unique pointers to have the flexibility to switch between mapping finite element and quadrature objects during runtime. So also, don't use geometry info. Geometry info works for packs and quads, but not for general cell types. And for that, so that you don't have to use this class, we have introduced a lot of utility functions. For example, you can query cell accessor information like number of faces or number of indices, like shown here. Also, I would like to repeat the point what I made a couple of slides before. Don't rely on default mapping and pass explicitly a mapping. Okay, so until now I've talked about simplex meshes, but we also have like an experimental support for mixed meshes. I don't have time to show you or go into detail about that here, but you can have a look at the code online. It's also on the simplex support page, and yeah, just one thing what I would like to mention here is, a bit spoiling, but it relies on the HP infrastructure quite nicely. Okay, so maybe there are some people among you that would like to start using the simplex support soon. Now, just a couple of recommendations from my side, how to start, what are the best resources for starting. So I've already mentioned the simplex support module page a couple of times. And of course, you can have a look at the release paper and have a look at the simplex test folder. It contains a lot of ported tutorials. Also, some of the ported application codes might help to get started how to use it actually in a complicated user code. So I would quickly just want to talk about the title of this title of this section of this presentation, why it's called experimental support. So essentially, deal.II is a huge library. So a lot of people have spent a lot of time to get to this stage at which we are right now, but there's still a lot of work to do. So there are known limitations like adaptivity is not supported, and we don't have right now high order support yet, which might be a problem for some of you, but I hope many of you who want to use simplex measure, this is an acceptable limitations for now. Also, of course, a lot of code has been written newly, so there's a high chance that there are still bugs in it. And of course, there's still the possibility that the interfaces will change. It very much depends on your feedback, how well the mixed mesh approach is, for example, taken from you. And of course, I would like to point out one thing, that deal.II is a community work. So if you find a bug or you think you found a bug, please report it. So maybe you have used it wrongly, but nevertheless, as I said, the probability that the bug is actually in the library is quite high. So we really appreciate that if you report it. And also, if some of you would like to contribute some features for this simplex stuff, we are happy to get you started with your PRs or something similar. And just write us and yeah, we will help you. Okay, actually that's all from us. So I think this was too much content for not enough time, but I hope it will help you to get started with the new features in deal.II 9.3 related to matrix-free, multigrid, non-matching, and simplex support.